Hello, welcome back. Today we are going to continue with our series of Rethinking Classical Political Economy. I'm going to be doing so by discussing three of the most important categories in classical political economy, which are use value, exchange value, and value, that have already been present in our discussion so far and that are going to appear in a really important fashion in the discussions that we're going to have from now on. So it's really important that we get these categories right, that we're able to extract from them all of the information that is relevant for the study of political economy. And that's why today I'm going to dive quite deep into these questions, not only because it's going to be relevant for this discussion, but also because a lot of the points that I'm going to speak about today are going to be relevant for my discussion of the conversation that I had with Socialism Left. So some of the challenges that he gave rise to in our conversation are going to be answered in part or in the whole by things that I'm going to say in this video. So if you want to understand properly the classical tradition and the Marxist tradition of economic thinking, you should pay attention to what I'm saying today. And even though I've already discussed these categories in other videos, today I'm going to do so in a more systematized manner, and I'm going to do so in a fairly deep fashion so that we all get, as I was saying, as much from this conversation as possible, right? Also, I'm going to try to discuss it in an honest manner, right? Trying to give an honest picture of the labor theory of value, which is the theory that I subscribe to and that many people in this tradition subscribes to. So let's get right into this discussion, and let's start by analyzing the concept of use value, right? What exactly is use value? Well, normally when we speak of use value in the classical tradition, in the Marxist tradition, we are speaking about the features, about the characteristics, the elements that form a given object that turn them into an object of social use, that turn them into a useful object. So the set of all of these characteristics, of all of these features, is what we call a use value, right? So as I was saying in other videos, these classes, for example, are a use value because they contain a set of properties, a set of characteristics, a set of features that make them useful. Now, objects of social use have existed all throughout human history, right? Every society needs to produce objects of social use because human beings need to exist, and for that they need certain objects that meet their needs and their wants, right? So useful objects, objects of social use, have been present all along. But in capitalist societies, they take the form of commodities, right? So all commodities are thus useful objects. They are objects of social use, but not all use values are commodities, because other societies that didn't have a commodity form also possessed use values. And as we saw in our last discussion, use values are what constitute the material wealth of any society. And the labor that is productive is that kind of labor that produces or transforms use values, right? So then, utility, how does utility really play into the picture here? How does it fit into this discussion? Well, utility is the property that useful objects have of satisfying some human need or want, right? So in some sense, in a more naive manner, we could be speaking about utility as something subjective, right? Because our needs and wants spring from our own minds. And whereas at a simple analytical stage, this might be the case, if we look at the picture more in a more complex manner, we can see that utility is not even that subjective, right? Because our needs and wants, first of all, human beings don't really have free will. At this point, we can say that human beings are deterministic beings, and we do not really have any libertarian notion of free will. So our needs and wants are themselves the product of a set of physical, of material conditions, whether of our own bodies or of society or social environment. And they are also objective in the sense that we can study them scientifically, and that is part of what psychology, well, that is pretty much the main purpose of psychology, is to study mental phenomena, right? Because our minds is the product of our brain, and our brain is a physical thing. So utility in this sense is not really that subjective. I mean, if you define subjective as being the product of our mind, as existing within our minds, then you could say that it's subjective, but our minds are the product of our brains, and our brains are themselves physical objects that are the objective objects that are the object of scientific inquiry, right? We are not really in a world of really esoteric entities moving around in unpredictable manner. We are actually speaking about something that we could also analyze scientifically. But you notice here that the utility is different from use value, although sometimes we can use them interchangeably, and I've done that in the past. But in reality, they're different, because one refers to the objective features that turn an object of social use into that compose basically an object of social use, whereas utility refers to the property that those objects have of satisfying some human need or want, and it's volatile, right? It changes a lot. Utility is not just a single rigid thing, because human needs and wants are also changing all the time, and they are also something that is not really constant throughout time. So okay, in this sense, we have this part of the picture. But this is clearly not the end of the picture, because you can see that useful objects in capitalist societies also have another property, which is that of being exchangeable. They have the property of being able to be exchanged against other objects. So in capitalism, useful objects become commodities, because now they have what we call an exchange value. So what is an exchange value? Well, exchange value refers, in my tradition of economic thinking, to the proportion in which a commodity or commodities exchange against one another. So is it a 1-to-1 proportion? Is it a 2-to-1 proportion? What proportion it is? And you can see that these proportions are quantitative, right? And also you can see that these proportions are social, in the sense that there is no natural thing apart from the social that determines that 1 kilogram of oranges exchanges in the market, let's say, for half a kilogram of wheat. This is not really something that it's a non-social property, right? It is clearly a social property, because commodities don't exchange against one another magically. There is a set of social relations that create these kinds of proportions. So then, since we see in the market that commodities get exchanged against one another in varying proportions, and that these proportions are really important for the study of political economy, right? Because they can tell us a lot of things. Then the question is, why? Why are the proportions the way they are, and why do they change in the specific manners in which they do? What exactly is it that determines these proportions? And this is the main goal of any theory of value, right? In capitalist societies, we are trying to explain exchange value. We're trying to explain the proportion between with which commodities exchange against one another in the market. So for this, we present a theoretical postulate, which is value. Now, value is supposed to be the regulator, the substance that determines these proportions in the market, right? And before we speak about what Marx thinks value is, about what Adam Smith and David Ricardo think that value is, let's delve a little bit more into the issue of exchange value. So you can see that exchange value is a social property that commodities have, and that exchange value really refers to this proportion in which commodities exchange one another. So how does a commodity's price play here? So how does it fit into this question? So it depends, of course, on how you define price. So if we define price as the specific, in modern terms, as the specific tag that we put into a commodity that gives us a number that expresses the amount of fiat money that you need to pay in order to receive that particular commodity, then price is not really going to be the same as exchange value, because you can see that price is just going to be a number referring to a quantity of fiat money that is supposed to give you the amount that you need to pay in order to get that commodity. So price is not really going to tell you a commodity's exchange value, but price alone, whereas price alone is not going to tell you in this sense, relative prices are going to tell you, right? Because you can see that if commodities, if one commodity, for example, is worth, commodity X is worth $10, and you don't know what any other commodity is worth, you don't know anything else, then asking and receiving the answer that a commodity is worth $10 is really the same as receiving an answer that goes something like blah 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 blah. You're not really going to know anything if you don't know what other commodities are worth. The fact that you know that it's 10 doesn't really tell you anything. However, if you start asking about what the price tag of other commodities are, and you start saying, well, this one is 10 too, this one is 1, this one is $5, then you can start comparing these prices. You can start taking the ratio of these prices, and what the ratio of these prices is going to tell you is basically exchange value. It's going to tell you the proportion to which two commodities exchange. So if commodity X costs $10 and commodity I costs $10, then you see that the exchange value of commodity X expressed in terms of commodity I is 1-to-1, is a 1-to-1 proportion, right? So you need to give whatever quantum of commodity I in order to get that particular quantum of commodity X. Perfect. So then you can see that commodities, insofar as they are considered as objects of exchange, they are qualitatively equal, because when we are dealing with commodities in exchange, we are abstracting from everything that makes a commodity useful, unique, right? Everything that makes a commodity unique, and we are only getting the one single property of these commodities, which is their quantitative worth. How much do I need to give up of something in order to get that particular commodity? And you can see here that there is a difference between the way in which we measure the quantitative worth and the property of having this quantitative worth itself, right? So commodities have the property of being exchangeable, of being commensurable. But this can be expressed in many different manners. We can measure it in many different manners. A commodity's exchange value can be measured in terms of gold, which is another commodity, in terms of silver, in terms of let's say corn, in terms of many other commodities, in fact in terms of all other commodities. And yet these particular ways in which we express it are different from the property that it has of being exchangeable. This is the same as, for example, the difference between the property of having height and the way in which we measure height, right? So centimeters don't cause you to have height. You have height, and the way in which you measure your height is using centimeters or feet or many other measures of height that there are out there, right? So the same goes for commodities. And what we know already is that this is a social property, and that all of these commodities, insofar as they are considered as objects of exchange, they are qualitatively equal but quantitatively comparable, right? So this costs X amount of that other commodity and Y amount of that other commodity and Z amount of another commodity. So they are quantitatively comparable and qualitatively equal. So what follows here is that the substance that is going to explain, is going to determine this exchange value, these proportions, has to be as well something that all commodities have in common. So something that if you only consider that thing, they are all qualitatively equal, but that they are all, but something that has different magnitudes, quantitative magnitudes. So something that makes them quantitatively comparable at the same time. And notice that it also has to be a social property, a social substance, because exchange value is itself also a social substance, right? So then, what is this thing that all commodities have in common? Theoretically speaking, then we can get to the empirics, but theoretically speaking, what is it that all commodities have in common? That if you only consider that thing, they're all qualitatively equal, but quantitatively comparable. What is that substance that is also a social substance? Well, theoretically, it's labor, right? Now, why is it labor? And first of all, it seems to be labor. So then our theory proposes that value, so the substance that determines, that induce commodities with their exchange value, so the determinant of a commodity's exchange value is going to be labor. Okay, so this is going to be value, because we said that value is supposed to be the element that determines, that regulates given the exchange value of a commodity, right? The proportion in which it exchanges with other commodities. So then, it is a social substance, labor. It is so it is a social substance, and we also need to add another caveat, which is that labor needs to be abstract labor, because all labors, and this is something that someone could also point out, all labors are different as well, right? The labor of a menial servant is not the same as the labor of a doctor. Is not the same as, there are many different labors, forms of labor, right? So when we are speaking about labor, we also need to abstract from everything that makes labor unique, every form of labor unique, because this is something that the market does. This is not something that economists themselves do. This is something that the market itself does, right? So there is an abstraction from everything that makes labor unique, and the only thing that remains is the only thing that all forms of labor have in common, which is the fact that they require some expenditure of time and human energy, right? Human time and energy. So this is what abstract labor means. It's this sense of time that is spent in the production of whatever commodity. Now, all forms of labor are different in the same way that all commodities are different, but this heterogeneity in the market is abstracted from, because all commodities in the market are treated as qualitatively equal, but quantitatively comparable, once again. So then the same goes for labor. So it needs to be abstract labor. And this is something that Marx noted that was not really that well understood by other economists in the classical tradition, by Adam Smith or David Ricardo, but Marx was very specific about this, right? It needs to be abstract labor. And it also needs to be socially necessary, because when we are dealing with a social phenomena, we obviously need to speak about the kind of labor that is socially necessary. And what does exactly socially necessary mean? Well, it means that it is conducted with the average technology and with the average productive capacities of a given society at a given time. So if you are spending more time than the socially necessary in the production of a given commodity, you're not adding more value, right? You are simply being more inefficient, and you're producing at a higher cost. But the socially necessary is this average amount that is required for the production of a given commodity, right? Now, socially necessary also means something else, which is that it needs to be condoned by society. There needs to be effective demand for a given commodity, for that commodity to actually exist, for that commodity to be a commodity. So socially necessary also means the amount of labor time that is required for the production of a given bundle of goods, of the same commodity or of different commodities, that is going to be condoned by demand in the market. Because if you produce more than what the market is going to demand, those extra objects are not really going to be commodities. You're not going to be able to sell them, and they're not going to be useful objects, because nobody is going to buy them. Nobody wants them, right? So you need also to take into consideration, and this is something that Marx certainly did not abstract from, although at certain points he does for analytical purposes. You can abstract, but it's something that you also need to include effective demand, right? And this is part of what socially necessary also means. It means not only the amount that is on average required for the production of a commodity, but also the amount that it's required for the production of a bundle of commodities that is going to be condoned by demand in the market, right? So we include certainly effective demand, and we are not abstracting from it. At least we are not abstracting from it when we are dealing with more complex parts of the story, right? At the beginning, we might be abstracting from it. Something that we are certainly abstracting from, at least for the moment, is use value, and we are abstracting also from utility. And why do we do this? Because you see, utility and use values and the uses that we give to the particular objects of social use are heterogeneous, and they are not quantifiable, and they are not comparable. Utility cannot be compared, cannot be quantified. We don't live in a world where we can talk about cardinal utility. We need to speak about ordinal utility, if at all. So then, since we really cannot compare and quantify these things, these cannot serve as the social substance that explains the the proportions in which commodities exchange against one another in the market. And furthermore, it also makes it quite, as I've said many times in the past, quite unfalsifiable, right? How can you falsify your theory if you propose a theory that is based on utility, if you cannot measure, if you cannot really quantify utility, if you cannot really measure it? How can you really give this an empirical testing? Now, the labor theory of value you can, and it has been shown to produce a set of hypotheses that are corroborated by empirical data. But this is not the case for utility at all, right? You cannot really compare, you cannot really measure utility. But labor you can. And this is part of the reason why we say that labor is value, is the substance that regulates exchange values, because it is something that makes all commodities qualitatively equal but quantitatively comparable. It is a social substance. And once we have this, we can produce some hypotheses that then are going to be tested against the real world to see whether or not our theory is actually empirically, well, not validated, but that it has some empirical corroboration, right? So then we are going to see in other videos the mechanisms by which labor becomes this substance of that we were speaking about, and the mechanisms by which we can really say that labor is the ultimate determinant of exchange value. But for now, let's keep in mind that theoretically speaking, we already have a really strong proposition for explaining the phenomena that we were trying to explain, which is these proportions in which commodities exchange against one another, right? Okay, so noting this, what if somebody might now say, okay, but all commodities, for example, have in common that they are the product of solar energy, right? They require some kind of some amount of solar energy to produce commodities. So why can we not bring about a theory of solar energy of value, solar energy theory of value? Well, first of all, it's not necessarily the case that solar energy is required for the production of all commodities. This is something that I would say that in some production processes, solar energy actually is unwanted, not only not useful, but actually unwanted. And probably, even if we were to concede that point, imagine that solar energy was used in all production processes. Why is that not value? Why does solar energy not create value? Because solar energy is not a social substance, right? The sun is not the active ingredient in production. The sun doesn't compete against anyone in the market. The sun is just a star that is at the center of our particular solar system, around which all of our planets gravitate. And it's certainly a really, really, really important thing for our lives and for life in this planet and so on and so forth. And solar energy is clearly an important part for many production processes. But this doesn't mean that it is the social substance that endues commodities with value. It is not value. It simply isn't. And again, it is not a social substance, even though it's a really important substance. It is not a social substance. So we cannot really say that solar energy is really the determinant of commodities, the proportions in which commodities exchange one another in the market. Now, if you want to bring about a theory that says so, and you think that you have an empirical case, you can also test that empirically. This is probably going to be more testable than utility theories, but I would argue that this is not going to be quite a good theory, because we already have another candidate that seems to be a lot better for the kind of phenomena that we're trying to explain. Okay, so solar energy can really not be considered as this substance that we could call value. But labor is still there, and labor is still an important one. So this is really why we end up with the conclusion that the immanent measure of a commodity's exchange value is the amount of abstract socially necessary direct and indirect labor time that went into that commodity's production. So it is the immanent measure because, as we're going to see in future videos, there is a process by which, if this is not the case, so if exchange values don't reflect labor times, they're not proportional to labor times, or if they are not really very close, then what we're going to see is there's going to be a set of social processes that make it so that now exchange values are regulated by relative labor times once again, right? So we are going to see this, and we are going to start with a simple economy, with a simple case where there are no capitalists, where there are only simple producers that produce for exchange. And then we're going to add in future videos a model where there is a division between the capitalist class and the proletariat, or the class that produces commodities. And then we're going to see what the effects are. But the picture is still going to be pretty much this. It's going to be that relative labor times are going to be the regulators, the main determinants of the exchange values of commodities, of the relative prices of commodities in the market. Because as we've seen, relative prices are what really tell us the exchange value of commodities with fiat money. And of course, if you include commodity money, such as gold, for example, the picture changes a little bit in the sense that gold itself is also a commodity, and it also has a quantitative worth to it. So you can also speak, and Marx himself spoke about money in these terms. But fiat money doesn't really alter the picture, because fiat money just, if you compare relative prices to one another, you can get these proportions. So although individual prices don't really tell us much, relative prices do. And this is why the labor theory of value is a theory of relative prices. And it is a theory of relative prices in the long run. Once all of these social processes that are relevant for market dynamics come into picture and make it so that there is a regulation of exchange values by relative labor times. So again, the importance here is on society. What is important to note here is that it is not the economist that wishes that this would be the case. It is a given social structure that of market economies where there is a prevalence of those producers that are able to produce at lower costs, and they're able to outcompete others. And there is this set of competitive struggle that make it so that a certain set of outcomes come into the picture. This is not really the product of individual minds wishing these outcomes into existence. This is the product of social processes of competition and so on that bring about these outcomes, right? And this is why labor is ultimately the source of value, because labor is the active ingredient in production. Producers, which are the ones that employ their labor in a simple economy, for example, are the ones that then compete in the market. And this competition is what ultimately guarantees that labor is, in fact, the determinant of exchange value. So this is the important thing. So whenever somebody says, well, why solar energy doesn't really, why can we not count solar energy, or why does it need to be labor? Because it is the active ingredient, and it is a social factor, and there is a set of social relations in capitalist societies that basically make it so that this is the case, right? So this is why, okay, and it's to some extent it's counterintuitive in some respects, but if you follow along and you notice that we are speaking about social phenomena, and we're speaking about a specific set of relations and of a competitive environment and so on and so forth, and this is something that we're going to see at the logic of this competitive struggle and what kind of outcomes it produces. But if you look at it, you will see clearly that labor is ultimately, at a theoretical level, what we can best propose is the substance of value, right? So then, keeping all of this in mind, this is why we define value to be abstract, socially necessary, direct and indirect labor time. because value in any theory of value is supposed to be the determinant of the proportion through which commodities exchange against one another in the market, and we find empirically and we also theorize that labor is going to be this main determinant. So this is why we say that value is abstract, socially necessary, direct and indirect labor time, because there's a lot of people that I've heard in online discourse that when asked what is value, right, in debates, people that defend the labor theory of value, they cannot really give an answer because they don't really know. So know this. There is a difference between use value, between exchange value, and between value. And value is going to be the regulator of exchange value. Okay? And next up, we are going to see in this series, we're going to see the social processes that bring about the regulation of exchange value by relative labor times. Okay? So we're going to see it first in a simple economy, in an economy of simple producers where there is no division of class, and then we're going to look at it in a society, in a capitalist society, where there is a distinction between the owner of the means of production and the producer. And we're going to see that the rule still holds pretty strongly, right? So this is what's coming up next, and then from here we can explain a lot more things, and we're certainly going to move to things relating profit exploitation, and ultimately we're trying to build our way into a theory of the business cycle and into other theories relating finance and many other things. But one of the key purposes really is to study the business cycle. Why do economies have these booms and busts, and what really explains these booms and busts, the duration, the intensity of these booms and busts, and a lot of these phenomena that we are ultimately trying to explain are pretty recent and pretty modern phenomena, right? So I'm trying to explain not only past things, but also modern, contemporary issues. And we can also give a hint at the future, right? So we are not really interested in making any sort of esoteric predictions about the future, but we can make some guesses about how the future is going to behave based on our theories. And this is a fundamental theoretical block of what is going to come next. So it's important that we understand these definitions. And with this in mind, I'm going to end this conversation, okay? Now, next up in the channel, not in this series, but in the channel, is going to be my detailed analysis of the conversation that I had with socialist and non-left. And hopefully you will find that something useful for your own studies. Please let me know about any questions about this particular topic you may have, any challenges that you may raise, that you may want to propose to me. And with that being said, I hope you all have a really good week, and I will see you in the next video.